The metallic tang of blood and antiseptic filled my nostrils as I rushed through the emergency department corridors at 3 a.m. Each step sent a sharp ache through my lower back, the result of 12 hours on my feet treating everything from overdoses to heart attacks. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor, making the St. Mary's emergency department feel more like a battlefield than a place of healing. I pressed my hand briefly against my stomach, a gesture that had become automatic over the past 4 months. The scrubs I wore were loose enough to hide the subtle changes in my body, but I could feel the small life growing inside me with every movement. The father was long gone, a fellow resident who'd transferred to California the moment he learned about the pregnancy. I'd made peace with raising this child alone, but the weight of that responsibility pressed down on me like a physical force. "Dr. Morrison, Trauma Bay 3 needs you now," called Sarah, one of the night nurses, her voice cutting through the ambient chaos of beeping monitors and muffled conversations. Her usually composed face was tight with concern, and I noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward the trauma bay. I grabbed a fresh pair of gloves from the dispenser, the latex snapping against my wrists as I pulled them on. "What do we have?" "GSW to the chest, multiple lacerations, possible internal bleeding. Patient was found unconscious in an alley downtown. No ID, no insurance information. The paramedics said it was touch and go during transport." Sarah's voice dropped lower as we approached the trauma bay. "Dr. Harrison is asking questions about whether we should transfer him to Metro General." Metro General was where the indigent cases went, where patients without proper insurance were shuttled when their injuries weren't immediately life-threatening. It was also where people sometimes died waiting for care that could have saved them. I'd seen it happen too many times in my 3 years as an emergency physician. "Let me assess him first," I said, pushing through the doors into Trauma Bay 3. The sight that greeted me made my breath catch. The man on the gurney was unconscious, his face pale beneath what looked like expensive but now blood-soaked clothing. Even in his current state, there was something commanding about his presence. His dark hair was matted with blood, and his strong jaw was set even in unconsciousness. The suit he wore, now cut away by the paramedics, was clearly custom-tailored, the fabric fine enough that I could tell it had cost more than my monthly salary. But it was his hands that caught my attention. Manicured but scarred, with calluses that spoke of violence alongside wealth. A thick gold signet ring adorned his right hand, the kind that old money families passed down through generations. Everything about him screamed power and danger, even as he lay vulnerable on my trauma table. "Vitals?" I asked, moving to his side and beginning my assessment. "BP dropping fast, pulse weak and thready. He's lost a lot of blood," reported Jake, the trauma nurse. "The bullet went in just below the left clavicle. Entry wound is clean, but we haven't located an exit wound yet." I placed my stethoscope against his chest, listening to the irregular rhythm of his heart. His breathing was shallow, labored. Without immediate intervention, he would die within the hour. Around us, the controlled chaos of the emergency department continued. But in this moment, the trauma bay felt like its own isolated world. "Get me 2 units of O-negative blood stat. I need chest x-rays and a CT scan to locate that bullet. And someone find Dr. Harrison." I was already reaching for the ultrasound machine, my hands moving with practiced efficiency, despite the exhaustion that made my bones ache. "Dr. Morrison." Sarah's voice held a note of uncertainty. "Dr. Harrison specifically said to stabilize and transfer. The patient has no insurance verification, and with the extent of his injuries—" I looked up sharply, meeting her gaze. "This man is dying. I don't care about his insurance status. We took an oath to do no harm, and letting him die because of paperwork violates everything we stand for." The unconscious man's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that I recognized. He was going into shock, his body shutting down from blood loss. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling the weak rise and fall of his breathing. For a moment, something odd flickered through me, an unexpected protectiveness toward this stranger who radiated danger even in unconsciousness. "Sarah, I need those blood units now. And call surgery. He's going to need an OR within the next 20 minutes if we're going to save him." As if summoned by my words, Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway. David Harrison was the department chief, a man in his 50s whose primary concerns had shifted from patient care to hospital politics and profit margins. He took one look at the expensive clothing scattered around the trauma bay, and his expression tightened. "Dr. Morrison, I thought I made my instructions clear. This patient needs to be transferred once stabilized." "Dr. Harrison, with respect, this man won't survive a transfer. The bullet is likely near his heart, and he's lost significant blood. Moving him now would be a death sentence." I kept my voice level, professional, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. Dr. Harrison's gaze moved to the patient, taking in the quality of his clothing, the expensive watch that Jake had removed and placed on the side table. I saw calculation in his eyes, the same look he got when evaluating the hospital's quarterly budget reports. "What's your assessment of his chances?" "If we operate within the next hour, I'd say 70-30 in his favor. If we transfer him, maybe 10%. The numbers were honest, brutal, and final. The man on the table stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of eyes the color of storm clouds. Even semi-conscious, there was an intensity in his gaze that made my pulse quicken involuntarily. "Paul," he whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. "Need to. Tell Paul." Dr. Harrison and I exchanged glances. Patients often became confused when in shock, calling out for family members or friends. But something about the urgency in his voice, even in his weakened state, suggested this was important. "Sir, you're in the hospital. You've been injured, but we're going to take care of you," I said softly, leaning closer to him. "What's your name?" His eyes focused on me with surprising clarity, studying my face as if memorizing it. When he spoke, his voice was stronger, carrying an authority that seemed incongruous with his current vulnerability. "Paul Torino," he said simply, and I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Dr. Harrison went rigid beside me. Sarah's face paled so dramatically I thought she might faint. Even Jake, usually unflappable, took an involuntary step backward. The name hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying weight and meaning that I was apparently the only one in the room not to understand. "Get him to OR2 immediately," Dr. Harrison said, his voice tight. "Dr. Morrison, you'll be the primary surgeon. Whatever this man needs, he gets. Full resources, no questions asked." The complete reversal in Dr. Harrison's attitude left me reeling. 5 minutes ago, he'd been ready to ship this patient to another hospital. Now he was authorizing unlimited resources. I wanted to ask questions, but the man, Paul Torino, was slipping back into unconsciousness, and every second we delayed decreased his chances of survival. As we rushed toward the operating room, Sarah leaned close to me. "Dr. Morrison, do you know who that is?" I shook my head, focused on monitoring Paul's vitals as we moved. His blood pressure was still dropping, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that preceded complete cardiovascular collapse. "Paul Torino controls half the construction contracts in the city. His family has connections to, well, let's just say they have influence with people you don't want to cross. The rumors about their business dealings." She trailed off, glancing nervously at the patient. The implications of her words settled over me like a cold weight. I was about to operate on a man who was apparently connected to organized crime, someone powerful enough to make Dr. Harrison abandon his usual penny-pinching policies. The smart thing would be to request another surgeon, to distance myself from whatever dangerous world this man inhabited. But as I looked down at Paul Torino's face, peaceful now in unconsciousness, I saw only a human being who would die without my intervention. Whatever he might be in the outside world, in this moment he was simply a patient who needed my skills to survive. Prepper 2 for emergency surgery. I instructed the surgical team as we reached the operating room. This is going to be complicated. As the anesthesiologist prepared Paul for surgery, I scrubbed in, my hands moving through the familiar ritual. The warm water and antiseptic soap couldn't wash away the feeling that I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. But as I looked through the observation window at the man whose life now rested in my hands, I knew there was no choice to make. I was a doctor first, and right now, Paul Torino needed me to save his life. The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of delicate work as I navigated around Paul Torino's heart, extracting the bullet that had lodged dangerously close to his aorta. His body had been through trauma that should have killed him, but he possessed a strength that defied medical explanation. Even unconscious, he seemed to be fighting for survival with an intensity I'd rarely witnessed. As I finally closed the last suture, dawn was breaking over the city. The bullet sat in a small metal dish beside the operating table, a flattened piece of metal that had come within millimeters of ending his life. I stared at it for a moment, wondering what series of events had led to someone putting it into Paul Torino's chest. "Excellent work, Dr. Morrison," said Dr. Patricia Wells, the anesthesiologist. She was a woman in her 40s who'd seen everything the emergency department could throw at her, but even she seemed shaken by the night's events. "I've never seen someone survive that kind of blood loss. He's got the constitution of a horse." I nodded, stripping off my surgical gloves and mask. Every muscle in my body ached, and the baby's weight seemed to press more heavily against my pelvis. I'd been on my feet for over 16 hours, and my body was demanding rest that I couldn't afford to take. "How long before he wakes up?" I asked, checking his vitals one more time. His heartbeat was strong and steady now. The crisis passed. "Could be hours, could be days. With the amount of anesthesia and blood loss, his body needs time to recover. But his signs are good. You saved his life." Paul Torino was transferred to the ICU, where he was given a private room at the end of the hall. I noticed the security measures immediately. 2 men in expensive suits positioned near the elevator, their eyes constantly scanning the corridor. They weren't hospital security. These men had the hard look of people accustomed to violence, and they watched everyone who passed with the intensity of predators. Dr. Harrison found me at the nurses' station, where I was updating Paul's chart. His expression was a mixture of relief and something that might have been fear. "Exceptional work, Dr. Morrison. Mr. Torino's family will be very grateful." He paused, lowering his voice. "They've asked specifically that you be his primary physician during his recovery. Whatever he needs, whatever resources are required, you have my full authorization." "Dr. Harrison, I appreciate the confidence, but I should mention that I'll need to reduce my hours soon. I'm pregnant, and the long shifts are becoming difficult." I'd been dreading this conversation, but the events of the night had left me too exhausted to maintain pretenses. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Then his expression softened slightly. "Congratulations. How far along?" 4 months. I haven't told anyone yet because..." I gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the complex emotions surrounding my pregnancy. "Because the father isn't in the picture," he said with surprising gentleness. "Dr. Morrison, in light of the Torino situation, I'd like to offer you a modified schedule. Reduced hours, but you'd be on call specifically for him and his associates. The compensation would be significantly higher than your current salary." The offer caught me off guard. It was exactly what I needed, medically and financially, but it also meant tying myself more closely to Paul Torino's dangerous world. "What kind of associates?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Dr. Harrison's expression grew carefully neutral. "People who value discretion and quality medical care." People who sometimes require treatment for injuries that might raise questions in a traditional setting. So I would become a doctor for criminals. The thought should have horrified me, but the practical part of my mind was already calculating the benefits. Better hours, higher pay, the ability to take care of my baby without worrying about finances. All I had to do was treat patients and ask no questions about how they'd acquired their injuries. "I'll consider it," I said finally. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine cases. Car accident victims, heart attack patients, the usual parade of human suffering that filled emergency departments. But my thoughts kept drifting to the man in ICU room 318, wondering who he really was and what kind of world I was being invited to enter. It was just after noon when Sarah found me in the break room, wolfing down a sandwich that tasted like cardboard. I'd learned to eat whenever possible during pregnancy, even when exhaustion killed my appetite. "Dr. Morrison, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. She held a newspaper, folded to reveal a headline that made my blood run cold. "Torino heir missing after downtown shooting." I took the paper with trembling hands, reading the article that detailed what the police knew about the previous night's events. According to witnesses, Paul Torino had been leaving a downtown restaurant when multiple gunmen opened fire. His bodyguards had been killed in the attack, and Paul himself had disappeared. The police were investigating, but the article made it clear that this was being treated as an organized crime incident. "They don't know he's here," Sarah whispered. "The family, the police, even the people who shot him. As far as the world knows, Paul Torino vanished." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Paul's enemies discovered he was alive and in our hospital, they might return to finish what they'd started, and if they did, anyone who had helped him could become a target. "Dr. Morrison?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right? You look pale." I set the newspaper down with hands that shook slightly. "I'm fine, just tired." But I wasn't fine. I was carrying the child of a man who'd abandoned me, treating a patient who might be one of the most dangerous criminals in the city. And apparently the only thing standing between Paul Torino and another assassination attempt was the fact that no one knew where he was. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "How is our patient doing, Dr. Morrison?" Ice ran through my veins. Whoever had sent the message knew about Paul, knew I was treating him, and knew my name. I looked around the break room, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. Another message appeared. "We should meet. Tonight. 8 p.m. St. Catherine's Church on 5th Street. Come alone." I stared at the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct told me not to go, to call the police, to find a way out of this situation. But another part of me, the part that had spent 4 hours saving Paul Torino's life, needed to know who was behind these messages and what they wanted. I deleted the messages and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Whatever happened tonight, I would face it. But first, I needed to check on my patient. ICU room 318 was quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Paul Torino lay still in the hospital bed, his face peaceful in unconsciousness. Someone had brought him expensive pajamas to replace the hospital gown, and his dark hair had been combed back from his forehead. Even injured and vulnerable, he possessed a presence that commanded attention. I checked his chart, noting that his vitals had remained stable throughout the morning. The surgery had been successful, but he would need weeks of recovery before he was back to full strength, weeks during which he would be vulnerable to his enemies. As I adjusted his IV drip, his eyes suddenly opened. Those storm-gray eyes I remembered from the night before, now alert and focused directly on me. "Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice still weak, but carrying unmistakable authority. "We need to talk." "You shouldn't be conscious yet," I said, immediately reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. "The anesthesia should keep you under for several more hours." Paul Torino's eyes tracked my movements with sharp intelligence, despite his weakened state. "I've always had a high tolerance for drugs," he replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. Occupational necessity. The casual way he referenced his dangerous lifestyle sent a chill through me. I was used to treating patients who tried to downplay their injuries or minimize their pain. Paul seemed to be the opposite, someone who acknowledged danger as a simple fact of his existence. You lost a significant amount of blood. The bullet missed your heart by less than an inch. You should be dead. I couldn't keep the clinical detachment in my voice as I examined the surgical site. The wound was healing well, but it would leave a scar that would serve as a permanent reminder of how close he'd come to dying. But I'm not dead thanks to you. His eyes never left my face as he spoke. Dr. Morrison, do you know who I am? Paul Torino. Beyond that, I prefer not to speculate about my patients' personal lives. It was a lie, and we both knew it. The newspaper article had made his identity impossible to ignore. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. Spoken like a true professional. But the world isn't always professional, Doctor. Sometimes we have to make choices based on incomplete information and trust our instincts. Before I could respond, the ICU door opened and a woman entered, who made the room feel suddenly smaller. She was perhaps 40, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. Her black suit was expensive and perfectly tailored, and she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. Paul, she said, her voice carrying a slight Italian accent. You look terrible. Hello, Isabella. Still the master of bedside manner, I see. Despite his weakness, Paul's tone held genuine warmth. Dr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet my sister, Isabella Torino. Isabella's attention shifted to me with laser focus. Her dark eyes took in every detail of my appearance, from my rumpled scrubs to the fatigue lines around my eyes. I felt as though I was being evaluated for some purpose I didn't understand. Dr. Morrison, Isabella said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured nails. My family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Paul tells me you saved his life. I was doing my job, I replied, shaking her hand and noting her surprisingly strong grip. Nevertheless, the Torino family does not forget those who help us. Isabella's smile was warm, but her eyes remained calculating. I understand you've been offered a position as Paul's personal physician. I glanced at Paul, surprised that word of Dr. Harrison's offer had traveled so quickly. I'm still considering it. Perhaps I can help you decide. Isabella reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. A token of our appreciation for your excellent care. I stared at the envelope, knowing without opening it that it contained more money than I made in several months. I can't accept that. I was doing my job, nothing more. Dr. Morrison, Paul's voice carried a note of amusement. My sister isn't offering you a tip. She's offering you an opportunity. Isabella nodded. The position would involve more than just treating Paul. Our family has various business interests, and sometimes our employees require medical attention. Discretion would be essential, but the compensation would reflect the unique nature of the work. The offer was tempting in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. As a single mother-to-be, financial security was a constant concern. But accepting would mean becoming part of the Torino organization, with all the moral compromises that would entail. I need time to think about it, I said finally. Of course. Isabella's smile didn't waver. Take all the time you need. But Dr. Morrison, you should know that Paul has enemies, people who would hurt him, and by extension, anyone who has helped him. Our protection extends to those who work with us. The words were spoken gently, but the threat was unmistakable. I was being offered a choice between the Torino family's protection and their potential enmity. It wasn't really a choice at all. I should check on other patients, I said, backing toward the door. Paul, get some rest. Your body needs time to heal. Dr. Morrison, Paul called out as I reached the door. The men who shot me, they're still out there. They know I survived, and they'll be looking for me. Anyone who has helped me could become a target. I turned back to face him, seeing genuine concern in his storm gray eyes. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you, he replied. There's a difference. I left the ICU with my mind reeling. The envelope Isabella had offered still sat on Paul's bedside table, a tangible reminder of the choice I was being asked to make. As I walked through the hospital corridors, I became aware of subtle changes in the atmosphere. Security guards who hadn't been there that morning, nurses who avoided making eye contact. An undercurrent of tension that suggested word of Paul Torino's presence had spread through the hospital staff. My phone buzzed with another text message. 8 p.m., St. Catherine's Church. Don't disappoint us. Whoever was sending these messages was growing impatient. I had less than 6 hours to decide whether to meet with them, and no idea what they wanted or who they represented. The smart thing would be to call the police, but Paul's warning about his enemies made me hesitate. If these people were willing to shoot him in broad daylight, what would they do to a pregnant doctor who got in their way? The afternoon shift brought a steady stream of patients, but I found it difficult to concentrate. My thoughts kept drifting to Paul Torino, lying in his ICU bed with his sister standing guard. What kind of man inspired such loyalty? And what kind of life had he lived that required constant vigilance against enemies who wanted him dead? At 6 p.m., I found myself back in the ICU, ostensibly to check on Paul's progress, but really to try to understand the man who had so dramatically altered the course of my day. He was awake, sitting up in bed and speaking quietly on a cell phone that definitely hadn't been there during my morning rounds. Make sure Tony understands that business continues as usual, he was saying. The construction contracts need to be finalized by Friday, regardless of my current situation. He ended the call when he saw me, setting the phone aside with a slight wince that suggested his chest was still causing him significant pain. You're supposed to be resting, I said, checking his bandages and noting that there was no sign of infection. Rest is a luxury I can't afford right now. My absence has created opportunities for my competitors, and some of them aren't inclined to wait for my recovery. Paul's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than potential business warfare. What kind of business do you do exactly? I asked, surprising myself with my directness. Paul studied my face for a long moment before answering. I provide services that people need but can't obtain through conventional channels. Construction, waste management, security consulting. Sometimes those services require unconventional methods. It was a carefully worded non-answer that confirmed everything I'd suspected about the Torino family's activities. They were criminals, but criminals who had learned to operate within the legitimate business world. And the people who shot you? Competitors who believe in more direct approaches to business negotiations. Paul's expression hardened slightly. They made a mistake when they tried to kill me in public. It shows a lack of professionalism that will ultimately be their downfall. The casual way he discussed his own attempted murder was chilling. This was a man who lived with the constant possibility of violence, who had built his life around the expectation that enemies might try to kill him at any moment. Dr. Morrison, Paul continued, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been contacted by anyone since my surgery? Anyone asking questions about my condition or requesting information about the hospital? My heart skipped a beat. The text messages suddenly took on a more sinister significance. Why do you ask? Because if my enemies know I'm here, they'll try to finish what they started, and they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. Paul's eyes searched my face. I can protect you, but only if you're honest with me. I pulled out my phone and showed him the text messages. Paul's expression grew darker with each word he read. St. Catherine's Church, he murmured. That's Russo territory. Dr. Morrison, under no circumstances should you go to this meeting. Who are the Russos? The family that tried to kill me last night. If they're reaching out to you, it means they know you saved my life, and they see you as either an asset or a threat. Paul struggled to sit up straighter, his face pale from the effort. I need to make some calls. Isabella needs to increase security around the hospital. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just a doctor who had treated a patient. I was now involved in a war between criminal families, and both sides apparently saw me as significant enough to monitor and potentially manipulate. I just wanted to save your life, I said quietly, my hand moving instinctively to protect my unborn child. Paul's expression softened. And you did. But actions have consequences, Dr. Morrison, especially in my world. The question now is what we do about it. As if summoned by his words, Isabella appeared in the doorway, her face grim. Paul, we have a problem. The Russos have people watching the hospital. They know you're here. The next few hours passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Isabella had arrived with additional security, men who positioned themselves strategically throughout the hospital with the quiet efficiency of a military operation. Dr. Harrison appeared nervous, but compliant, clearly understanding that the hospital's cooperation was not optional. I found myself in the strange position of being both protected and watched. One of Isabella's men, a tall, broad-shouldered Italian-American named Marco, had been assigned as my shadow. He followed me through my rounds with polite discretion, but his presence served as a constant reminder that my life had fundamentally changed. Dr. Morrison, Marco said as I finished checking on a car accident victim in the emergency department. Mrs. Torino would like to speak with you privately. I followed him to a small conference room that had been appropriated for the Torino family's use. Isabella sat at the head of the table, several cell phones arranged before her like weapons. She looked up as I entered, her expression serious, but not unkind. Please sit, she said, gesturing to a chair across from her. We need to discuss your situation. My situation. I sat down carefully, acutely aware of Marco's presence by the door. The Russo family has made you a person of interest. They believe you can provide information about Paul's condition and our security arrangements. They've also discovered some interesting details about your personal life. Isabella opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of me leaving my apartment that morning, clearly taken with a telephoto lens. Someone had been watching me, documenting my movements. The violation of my privacy was somehow worse than the physical threat. How did they get this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The Russos have resources throughout the city. Police contacts, private investigators, people who can find information about anyone they target. Isabella leaned forward slightly. They know about your pregnancy, Dr. Morrison. They know you're single and struggling financially. They see vulnerabilities they can exploit. My hand moved protectively to my stomach. The idea that these criminals knew about my unborn child made me feel sick and exposed. What do they want from me? Information about Paul's condition, his security arrangements, his visitors. They want you to be their source inside our operation. Isabella's voice was matter of fact, as if she was discussing a business transaction rather than my potential betrayal of her family. And if I refuse? Isabella's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. The Russos are not known for accepting refusal gracefully. They would likely try to coerce your cooperation through threats or violence. The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped between two criminal families, both of whom saw me as either an asset or a liability. My medical training had prepared me to save lives, not navigate the treacherous politics of organized crime. What are my options? You can accept our protection and become part of our organization. Paul's offer of a position as our family physician still stands. with significantly increased compensation and security for you and your child. Isabella paused, letting the offer sink in. Or you can try to return to your normal life and hope the Russos lose interest in you. It wasn't really a choice. Returning to normal life would mean looking over my shoulder constantly, wondering if every stranger posed a threat to me and my baby. Accepting the Torino family's protection would mean entering their world permanently, but it would also mean security and financial stability. If I accept your offer, what would my responsibilities be? Primarily caring for Paul during his recovery, occasionally treating other family members or associates when they require medical attention, maintaining absolute discretion about anything you see or hear. Isabella's tone was businesslike, but her eyes remained watchful. In return, you would receive a substantial salary, comprehensive health insurance, and our complete protection. And if I ever wanted to leave? People don't usually leave our family, Dr. Morrison. We take care of our own, and in return, we expect loyalty. The words were spoken gently, but the implication was clear. Once I joined the Torino organization, leaving would not be a simple matter of resignation. My phone buzzed with another text message. Isabella gestured for me to check it. The church meeting is in 2 hours. We know you're with them now. This doesn't change anything. We'll be in touch. Isabella read the message over my shoulder, her expression darkening. They're escalating. Marco, I want the doctor's apartment under surveillance immediately. If the Russos try to approach her there, I want to know about it. Mrs. Torino, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to save your brother's life. Isabella's expression softened slightly. I know, but sometimes life makes choices for us, and we have to adapt. Dr. Morrison, you saved Paul's life, which means you saved our family's future. The least we can do is protect yours. There was a knock at the conference room door, and one of Isabella's men entered with urgent purpose. Ma'am, we have movement. Russo vehicles have been spotted 3 blocks from the hospital. They're positioning for something. Isabella stood immediately, all business. How many vehicles? At least 4 that we've identified. Could be more. They're being careful to stay out of direct sight of the hospital. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. The Russo family wasn't just watching me. They were preparing for some kind of action. The hospital, my workplace, the place where I dedicated my career to healing people, was about to become a battleground between criminal families. Dr. Morrison, Isabella said, her voice carrying new urgency. I need you to make a decision now. Accept our protection, or we evacuate you to a safe location until the situation resolves itself. What about the other people in the hospital? The patients, the staff? The Russos won't risk a public confrontation that would bring too much police attention, but they might try to extract you or Paul during the chaos of an emergency evacuation. Isabella was already moving toward the door. Marco, get the doctor to Paul's room. I want both of them in the most secure location we have. As we hurried through the hospital corridors, I caught glimpses of the security preparations. Isabella's men had positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the building, their radios crackling with coded communications. The hospital staff went about their duties with nervous efficiency, clearly aware that something dangerous was developing. Paul's ICU room had been transformed into a command center. Additional monitors had been brought in, along with communications equipment that definitely wasn't hospital-issued. Paul himself was sitting up in bed, fully alert and clearly frustrated by his physical limitations. Isabella, what's the situation? He asked as we entered. The Russos are moving. At least 4 vehicles, probably more men. They're being cautious, but they're definitely planning something. Isabella moved to the window, carefully adjusting the blinds to observe the street below. Paul's attention shifted to me. Dr. Morrison, have you made your decision? I looked around the room at the assembled members of the Torino organization. These were criminals, people who lived by violence and intimidation. But they were also offering me protection and financial security that I desperately needed. More importantly, they were the only thing standing between me and the Russo family's attempts to use me against them. "I accept your offer," I said, the words feeling heavy and final. Paul's expression showed relief and something that might have been respect. "Welcome to the family, Dr. Morrison. Marco, make sure she understands the security protocols." As Marco began explaining the procedures that would govern my new life, I felt the last vestiges of my old existence slipping away. I was no longer just Dr. Paige Morrison, emergency physician. I was now Dr. Morrison, Torino family associate, bound to these people by choices I'd made and circumstances beyond my control. Outside, the sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, where two criminal families prepared for a confrontation that would determine my future. I placed my hand over my growing belly, silently promising my unborn child that whatever happened next, I would find a way to keep us both safe. The war for Paul Torino's life, and by extension my own, was just beginning. The attack came at precisely 9:30 p.m., just as the evening shift was settling into their routines. I was checking Paul's vitals when the lights in the ICU flickered and went out for a moment before the emergency generators kicked in. In that brief darkness, I heard the sharp crack of breaking glass from somewhere below us. "They're inside," Paul said, his voice deadly calm despite his weakened condition. "Isabella." "They're inside," Paul said, his voice deadly calm despite his weakened condition. "Isabella, get Dr. Morrison to the safe room now." But Isabella was already moving, her hand inside her jacket where I now realized she carried a weapon. "Marco, escort the doctor. Third contingency." Her voice carried through the room with military precision. Marco's large hand closed gently but firmly around my arm. "Ma'am, we need to move. Now." The safe room turned out to be a converted storage area 3 floors up, accessible only through a service elevator that required a special keycard. As we made our way through corridors that had suddenly become alien and dangerous, I could hear the controlled chaos erupting throughout the hospital. Emergency alarms were blaring, but beneath that sound was something more sinister, the sharp reports of what could only be gunfire. "The patients," I said, pulling against Marco's grip. "I can't just abandon my patients. The other doctors will handle the medical emergencies. Right now, you're the target, and keeping you safe protects everyone else in this building." Marco's voice was kind, but unyielding as he guided me into the service elevator. The safe room was small but well-equipped, with monitors showing feeds from security cameras throughout the hospital. I watched in horrified fascination as men in dark clothing moved through the corridors with tactical precision. They weren't random thugs. These were professionals, and they were searching for something specific. "They're looking for Paul," I whispered, recognizing the pattern of their search. "And you," Marco replied, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "The Russos know that taking you would give them leverage over Paul and our family." On one of the monitors, I watched a team of Russo soldiers approach the ICU. They moved with confidence, clearly expecting to find Paul in his room. What they found instead was Isabella and 3 of her men, ready for a fight. The confrontation was brief, but violent. Isabella's team had the advantage of defensive positioning, but the Russos had superior numbers. Through the silent security feed, I watched the firefight unfold with clinical detachment, my medical mind automatically cataloging the injuries I observed. "Mrs. Torino is handling herself," Marco observed with what sounded like professional pride. "She learned to shoot before she learned to read." The comment reminded me that I was now part of a world where violence was not just possible but expected. These people had grown up understanding that conflict would be resolved through force, that survival depended on being more dangerous than your enemies. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the shooting stopped. The monitors showed Russo soldiers retreating, carrying their wounded with the same efficiency they'd shown during their assault. They had failed to find Paul, failed to capture me, and lost several men in the process. Isabella's voice crackled through the radio Marco carried. "All clear. Bring the doctor back to the command center." Paul's ICU room had been transformed during the attack. The hospital bed had been moved to a more defensible position, and additional security equipment had been installed. Paul himself looked pale but alert, clearly frustrated by his inability to participate directly in his own defense. "Casualties?" he asked as Isabella entered, a small bandage on her left hand, the only visible sign that she'd been in a firefight. "2 of ours wounded, neither seriously. 4 of theirs confirmed down, at least 3 more injured." Isabella's report was matter of fact, but I could see the adrenaline still coursing through her system. They won't try a direct assault again. This was them testing our defenses. "Which means they'll try subtlety next," Paul said, his storm gray eyes finding mine. "Dr. Morrison, I'm sorry you had to see this, but you needed to understand what being part of our family means." I thought about the men I'd watched fall on the security monitors, the casual way Isabella reported casualties, the matter-of-fact discussion of future attacks. This was my new reality, a world where violence was a business tool and human life was measured in terms of strategic advantage. "How do you live like this?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop myself. "Constantly watching for enemies, always ready for someone to try to kill you?" Paul's expression grew thoughtful. "You adapt. You learn to see threats before they develop, to value loyalty above everything else, to understand that strength is the only currency that matters." He paused, studying my face. "But you also learn to appreciate the good things more deeply. Family, trust, the people who stand with you when everything else falls apart." Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock and fear. "Dr. Morrison, I need to speak with you privately." Isabella nodded her permission, and I followed Dr. Harrison to a quiet corner of the ICU. His hands shook as he spoke, the events of the evening having clearly shattered his comfortable assumptions about hospital administration. "The police are asking questions about tonight's incident. They want to interview you about your relationship with the Torino family." Dr. Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been instructed to tell them that you were simply treating a patient, nothing more." "Instructed by whom?" "People who made it clear that the hospital's continued operation depends on our cooperation with the Torino family's version of events." Dr. Harrison looked older than his 60 years, worn down by the realization that his hospital was now caught between criminal families. "Dr. Morrison, I can't protect you from this anymore. Whatever arrangement you've made with these people, you're on your own." The abandonment stung, but I understood his position. Dr. Harrison was a good man who'd found himself in an impossible situation. He was choosing the safety of his hospital and its hundreds of employees over one doctor who'd gotten involved with dangerous people. When I returned to Paul's room, I found him in deep conversation with a man I hadn't seen before. Tall and lean with silver hair and expensive clothes, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Dr. Morrison," Paul said, "I'd like you to meet my uncle, Vincent Torino." Vincent's handshake was firm, his dark eyes evaluating me with the same intensity I'd seen in both Paul and Isabella. "The doctor who saved my nephew's life. The family is in your debt." "I was doing my job," I replied, the phrase becoming automatic. "Nevertheless, you've proven yourself tonight. Not many people could have handled the stress of a firefight while maintaining their professional responsibilities." Vincent's voice carried the slight Italian accent I was beginning to recognize as a family trait. "Paul tells me you've agreed to join our organization." "I've agreed to serve as your family's physician," I corrected, wanting to maintain some distinction between medical practice and criminal activity. Vincent's smile was knowing. "In our world, Dr. Morrison, there's no such thing as partial involvement. You're either with us completely, or you're a potential threat." His tone remained pleasant, but the message was clear. The good news is that we take care of our own better than any legitimate organization could." As if to prove his point, Marco appeared with a thick envelope. "The first month's salary," he explained, handing it to me, "plus a signing bonus and funds to relocate to a more secure apartment." I stared at the envelope, knowing it contained more money than I'd ever held at one time. The Torino family's definition of taking care of their own apparently involved financial compensation that dwarfed anything I could earn through legitimate medical practice. "There's something else," Paul said, his voice carrying a note of hesitation I hadn't heard before. "Dr. Morrison, the attack tonight wasn't just about eliminating me. The Russos specifically asked about you during their assault. They want you alive and unharmed." Ice ran through my veins. "Why?" "Because they believe you can provide ongoing intelligence about our family's operations. They see you as a long-term asset, someone they can turn against us." Paul's expression was grim. "Which means they'll never stop trying to get to you." The full implications of my situation finally crystallized. I wasn't just caught between two criminal families. I was a strategic asset that both sides wanted to control. The Russos would keep trying to capture or convert me, while the Torinos would never let me go because my defection would represent a catastrophic security breach. "So I'm trapped," I said quietly. "You're protected," Vincent corrected. "There's a difference. Dr. Morrison, you saved Paul's life, which means you saved the future of our family. In return, we'll ensure that you and your child never want for anything. Security, comfort, purpose, everything you need will be provided." Isabella stepped forward. "I've taken the liberty of arranging a new apartment for you. Top floor of one of our buildings, excellent security, close to the hospital. You can move in whenever you're ready." The speed with which they'd reorganized my life was breathtaking. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being an overworked emergency physician to being a protected asset of one of the city's most powerful criminal families. Every aspect of my existence was now subject to their oversight and control. What about my old life, my apartment, my things? "Marco's team has already packed your belongings. Everything you owned is being moved to your new place tonight." Isabella's efficiency was both impressive and terrifying. "We've also arranged for your medical school loans to be paid off, and your credit cards cleared. Financial stress is a security vulnerability we prefer to eliminate." I should have been grateful. They were solving every practical problem I faced, providing security and luxury beyond my wildest dreams. But the speed and thoroughness of their takeover felt like erasure, as if Dr. Paige Morrison was being systematically replaced by some new version of herself that existed solely within the Torino family's sphere of influence. Paul seemed to sense my emotional struggle. "Dr. Morrison, I know this feels overwhelming, but you'll find that our family takes care of each other in ways that the outside world can't understand. You're not losing your identity. You're gaining a new one that's stronger and more secure." As the night wore on, I found myself alone with Paul, while the others handled various aspects of security and logistics. His color was much better, and he was moving with less pain, but he still needed several more days of recovery before he could leave the hospital. "Tell me about your child's father," he said suddenly, his direct question catching me off guard. "He's not in the picture. He transferred to California when he learned about the pregnancy." The familiar pain of abandonment twisted in my chest. "His loss," Paul said simply. "Our gain." "Your gain?" "You'll understand eventually. Our family doesn't just acquire assets, Dr. Morrison. We create bonds that last lifetimes. Your child will grow up protected, educated, and cherished. They'll never know the fear or uncertainty that most children experience." The promise was seductive, especially coming from a man who clearly understood the value of loyalty and protection. But it also carried implications that made me uncomfortable. My child would grow up in a world where violence was normal, where moral compromises were business decisions, where strength was measured in terms of the ability to hurt one's enemies. What if I want something different for my child? Paul's smile was gentle but unyielding. What parent doesn't want their child to be safe, successful, and protected? We can provide all of that and more. Your child will have opportunities that legitimate money can't buy. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital walls with pale light, I realized that my old life was truly over. Dr. Paige Morrison, struggling single mother and overworked emergency physician, had been replaced by Dr. Morrison, Torino family physician and protected asset. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and terrifying in its totality. But as I watched Paul sleep peacefully for the first time since his surgery, I also felt something unexpected, a sense of belonging. These dangerous people had accepted me completely, had reorganized their world to accommodate my needs, had offered me a security and purpose I'd never imagined possible. Whatever moral compromises lay ahead, whatever violence I might witness, whatever choices I might be forced to make, I was no longer alone. I was part of something larger than myself, something that valued loyalty above law and family above everything else. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, as I placed my hand over my growing belly and felt my child stir to life, I felt something dangerously close to contentment. 3 weeks later, I stood in the penthouse apartment that had become my new home, watching the city sprawl beneath me through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was larger than any home I'd ever imagined living in, furnished with impeccable taste and secured by the most advanced systems money could buy. Every comfort had been provided, every need anticipated, every vulnerability addressed. I was a princess in a tower, if princesses carried stethoscopes, and their towers were owned by the Mafia. Paul had been discharged from the hospital 5 days earlier, against my medical advice but in accordance with his determination to resume control of his business operations. His recovery had been remarkable, aided by the kind of private medical care that only unlimited resources could provide. Physical therapists, nutritionists, and specialists had attended him around the clock, accelerating his healing in ways that standard hospital care never could have achieved. Now he worked from his own penthouse, 2 floors above mine in the same building, conducting business with the ruthless efficiency that had built the Torino empire. I found myself summoned to check on him several times a day, ostensibly for medical reasons, but increasingly for consultations that had nothing to do with his health. "Dr. Morrison," he said, as I entered his office that morning, barely looking up from the documents spread across his massive desk. "I need your professional opinion on something." I approached cautiously, noting the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was dealing with more than routine business matters. The scar from his surgery was barely visible beneath his expensive shirt, but I knew it still caused him discomfort during stressful situations. "What kind of professional opinion?" Paul finally looked up, his storm-gray eyes meeting mine with an intensity that still made my pulse quicken. "One of our associates was injured last night. Gunshot wound to the abdomen. He's being treated at a private facility, but I'd like you to evaluate his condition." The request wasn't unexpected. Over the past 3 weeks, I'd been called to treat various business-related injuries among the Torino organization's members. Knife wounds, broken bones, bullet grazes, the kinds of injuries that raised questions in hospital emergency departments, but were routine occupational hazards in their world. "I'll need to examine him personally to make an accurate assessment," I said. "Of course. Marco will drive you to the facility this afternoon." Paul's attention returned to his paperwork, but something in his posture suggested there was more to this particular case. "Dr. Morrison, this man is family, not by blood, but by choice. His recovery is important to our organization's stability." The emphasis on family carried weight in the Torino world. I'd learned that the distinction between blood relatives and chosen family was crucial to understanding their loyalty structure. Both categories commanded absolute dedication, but chosen family sometimes carried even greater significance because their allegiance was earned rather than inherited. "I understand," I replied. though I wasn't sure I understood anything about the complex web of relationships and obligations that governed their world. As I turned to leave, Paul's voice stopped me. "Dr. Morrison, how are you feeling? The pregnancy is progressing well?" The question caught me off guard, as his personal inquiries always did. Paul had taken an unusual interest in my pregnancy, ensuring that I had access to the best prenatal care and monitoring my health with an attention that went beyond professional concern. "Very well, thank you. The baby is active and healthy." I placed my hand over my expanding belly, which was now impossible to hide despite the loose-fitting clothes I favored. "Good. Our family physician needs to be in perfect health." Paul's smile was warm, but his eyes held that calculating look I'd come to recognize. "Have you given any thought to names?" The personal nature of the question made me uncomfortable. Paul's interest in my pregnancy felt possessive in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. "It's still early for that." "Perhaps. But it's never too early to think about the child's future. Their education, their opportunities, their place in the world." Paul's voice carried the same tone he used when discussing business strategy. "A child born into our family has advantages that others could never imagine." The conversation felt like it was heading toward territory I wasn't ready to explore. Paul's references to our family and their place in the world suggested a level of involvement in my child's life that I hadn't agreed to and wasn't sure I wanted. "I should prepare for this afternoon's consultation," I said, backing toward the door. "Of course. But Dr. Morrison, we should discuss the child's future soon. There are arrangements to be made, preparations to be completed. Our family takes care of its own, especially the children." The drive to the private medical facility took us through parts of the city I'd never seen, industrial areas where the Torino family's legitimate businesses operated alongside their more questionable enterprises. Marco, who had become my constant companion over the past weeks, navigated the route with familiar ease. "The man we're seeing?" I asked, as we pulled up to an unmarked building. "How was he injured?" Marco's expression grew grim. "Business dispute with the Russos. They're still trying to pressure our operations, looking for weaknesses they can exploit." He paused, studying my face. "Dr. Morrison, you should know that your presence in our family has made you a target. The Russos see you as someone they can use against Mr. Paul." The warning wasn't new, but the reminder still sent a chill through me. Despite the security that surrounded my new life, I was constantly aware that my safety depended on the Torino family's continued ability to protect me from their enemies. The private facility was more sophisticated than I'd expected, with medical equipment that rivaled what we'd had at the hospital. The patient, a man named Tony Ricci, had indeed suffered a serious abdominal wound, but the initial treatment had been excellent. As I examined him, I was struck by the quality of care he'd received. "Who treated him initially?" I asked the nurse, a professional woman who clearly had extensive trauma experience. "Dr. Sarah Chen. She's one of 3 physicians we keep on retainer for situations like this." The nurse's matter-of-fact tone suggested that situations like this were routine occurrences. I'd heard of Dr. Chen, a surgeon who'd left mainstream medicine under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Apparently, she'd found new employment with the Torino organization, treating injuries that couldn't be taken to legitimate hospitals. "Mr. Ricci's recovery should be straightforward with proper care," I told Paul when I called to report my findings. "Dr. Chen's work was excellent. He should be back to full strength within 6 weeks." "Good. Tony is important to our operations, and his family has served ours for 3 generations." Paul's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who valued continuity and loyalty. "Dr. Morrison, I'd like you to oversee his recovery personally. Consider it part of your expanded responsibilities." The expanded responsibilities had been growing steadily over the past weeks. What had started as treating Paul's gunshot wound had evolved into managing healthcare for his entire organization. I was becoming the Torino family's personal physician, responsible for the well-being of soldiers, associates, and their families. It was meaningful work in ways that hospital emergency medicine had never been. These people trusted me completely, valued my skills, and showed appreciation that went far beyond professional courtesy. But it also meant deeper involvement in their world, greater knowledge of their activities, and increased difficulty in maintaining any moral distance from their operations. That evening, I found myself on my apartment's private terrace, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and red. The view was spectacular, the luxury overwhelming, but I felt isolated in ways that had nothing to do with physical location. "Beautiful evening," Paul's voice came from behind me, and I turned to find him emerging from the private elevator that connected our floors. His arrival was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Despite everything, his presence had become a source of comfort. "You shouldn't be exerting yourself climbing stairs," I said automatically, my medical training asserting itself. "The elevator, actually, and my recovery is nearly complete, thanks to your excellent care." Paul moved to stand beside me at the terrace railing, close enough that I could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. "How are you adapting to your new life?" The question was complex, loaded with implications about choice and acceptance. "It's different from what I expected," I said carefully. "Different how?" I considered my words, aware that honesty might reveal more vulnerability than was wise. "More isolated than I thought it would be, more complex morally, more secure financially, but less secure emotionally." Paul nodded as if my response confirmed something he'd already suspected. Isolation is one of the costs of joining our world. Most people can't understand the choices we make or the pressures we face. But you're not isolated, Dr. Morrison. You're part of a family now. "A family that kills people for business reasons," I said, surprising myself with my directness. "A family that protects what's ours and eliminates threats to our survival," Paul corrected, his tone matter-of-fact. "The world isn't divided into good people and bad people. It's divided into those who have power and those who don't, those who can protect what they love and those who can't." The philosophy was seductive in its simplicity, offering a framework that made moral compromise seem like practical necessity. But it also represented a worldview fundamentally different from everything I'd been taught to believe about right and wrong. "What about the baby?" I asked, my hand moving protectively to my belly. "What kind of world am I bringing them into?" Paul's expression softened, and he moved closer, his hand coming to rest gently over mine on my stomach. The gesture should have felt presumptuous, but instead it felt protective, comforting. "A world where they'll be cherished, protected, and given every opportunity to succeed. A world where family loyalty is valued above everything else, where strength and intelligence are rewarded, where they'll never know the fear of being alone or vulnerable." Paul's voice was gentle but certain. "Your child will grow up surrounded by people who would die to protect them." The promise was both wonderful and terrifying. My child would indeed be safe and cared for, but they would also be raised in a world where violence was normal, where moral compromise was expected, where loyalty to the family superseded all other considerations. And if they want something different, if they want to leave this world? Paul's hand tightened slightly over mine. Why would they want to leave a family that loves them? But if they chose to pursue legitimate business, education, or other interests, they would have our complete support. Many of our family members work in legal professions, Dr. Morrison. We value success in all its forms. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Isabella, who emerged from the elevator with the purposeful stride that meant business. Her expression was serious, but not alarmed, suggesting important news rather than immediate crisis. "Paul, we have developments in the Russo situation," she said, nodding politely to me before focusing on her brother. "Vincent wants to meet with you tonight." Paul sighed, his moment of relaxation clearly ending. Dr. Morrison, we'll continue this conversation soon. There are decisions to be made about your future and the babies. As they prepared to leave, Isabella turned back to me. Dr. Morrison, you should know that the Russo family has been asking questions about your pregnancy. They're trying to understand the significance of your child to our organization. Ice ran through my veins. What kind of significance? They believe that your child represents a permanent bond between you and our family. They see it as a complication to their plans for turning you against us. Isabella's expression was concerned but determined. Which means your child's safety is now a strategic consideration in our conflict with them. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My unborn child was now a factor in a war between criminal families. A piece on a chessboard where the stakes were life and death. The Russos might try to use my pregnancy against the Torinos, while the Torinos would see my child as additional reason to ensure my permanent loyalty. I'll increase your security detail, Paul said, his voice carrying the cold authority I'd heard him use when discussing business. And Dr. Morrison, it's time to make your living arrangements permanent. This isn't just about your safety anymore. As they left, I remained on the terrace, my hands pressed protectively over my growing belly. The baby kicked, a strong flutter that reminded me of the life developing inside me, a life that was now inextricably connected to the Torino family's fortunes. I thought about the choices that had led me to this moment. Saving Paul's life, accepting the family's protection, agreeing to become their physician. Each decision had seemed reasonable at the time, necessary for my survival and my child's well-being. But together, they had created a web of obligation and dependency that I could no longer escape. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, as I watched the lights come on across the city below, I felt something unexpected, a sense of belonging. The Torino family had accepted me completely, had reorganized their world to accommodate my needs, had offered me security and purpose beyond anything I'd ever imagined. My child would grow up protected and cherished, surrounded by people who valued family above everything else. They would never know the fear and uncertainty that had defined my own childhood, would never struggle financially, or wonder if anyone would be there when they needed help. Whatever moral compromises lay ahead, whatever violence I might witness, whatever choices I might be forced to make, my child and I were no longer alone. We were part of something larger than ourselves, something that would fight to protect us with every resource at their disposal. As I felt the baby move again, stronger this time, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. This was my new life, my new family, my new world. Whatever the future held, I would face it as a member of the Torino organization, bound to them by choice, circumstance, and the growing life inside me that would soon become the newest member of their family. The transformation was complete. Paige Morrison had found her place in Paul Torino's world, and she was home.